This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you, Mark. It was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody who's here, either virtually or in person, to listen to this presentation, which is not about Barbara McClintock for a change. This is a presentation that stems from work that I started many, many years ago. And I like to give you a perspective on that work. The background for my story began in 1985 while I was searching for publications to document my first edition of the plants of San Salvador Island in the Bahamas. The picture of our cover of our first edition is on the right side of the screen. I was invited to the Bahamas in the early 1980s to actually teach a class on the botany, marine botany. And I had a little bit of background on phycology, and so I started to do that. While we were down there, my students kept asking me, what's this plant? What's that plant on the terrestrial land? And I didn't know. And so I started to try to find publications to try to help them and myself. And from that, the director of the field station asked us to write a common plants guide with illustrations because there wasn't anything available at the time for the non-botanists. So the class was a general education course for non-botanists. And from that, we began looking for published papers to include in our common plants guide, which was actually illustrated by one of my students, Tony Kowalski. In 1995, while I was waiting to board the plane to attend the first symposium on the botany of the Bahamas on San Salvador Island, which is currently called the Natural History of the Bahamas, I met Dr. Hardy Eschba. And here's a picture of Hardy on the right that I took many years later. So who was this guy and why is he so important to my story? Hardy was a Cornellian and an Indiana University PhD who later became interested in the Bahama flora. At this 1985 Bahamas conference that we were going to, he presented an unpublished distribution map for plants that were compiled by William Thomas Gillis that he had actually found in the herbarium at Michigan State University. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see this distribution map, one of many hundreds that are currently in the Michigan State University herbarium. And what Gillis did is he began looking and became interested in the Bahama flora in the early 70s, actually the late 80s. And he began documenting the distribution of all the plants of the Bahamas on these distribution maps. And each one of the little dots there represents a plant that he had either collected or he had found in the literature or he came across in a herbarium. So this really helped us figure out, well, what were the plants that were on San Salvador by looking at Gillis's maps. So during this time, as I said, we were looking to find publications, and we came across this big book that had just recently been published by Carrell and Carrell called The Flora of the Bahama Archipelago. And this book was basically for taxonomists. It was not a book for the general public. It had descriptions in Latin, and we got a copy of it and schlepped it in our backpacks down to San Salvador on a regular basis while trying to describe the plants of the Bahamas for our book. And what we noticed was in the preface to this book was an acknowledgement to the National Science Foundation for funding the publication of the book. And the other thing we noticed was that there were no or very few references to Dr. Gillis's publications. So I said to Hardy, why was Gillis's work ignored in the Carrell's recently published Flora of the Bahama Archipelago? Well, Hardy, oh, where am I? Sorry, going the wrong direction. There we go. So Hardy suggested that I contact associates who might know the answers to my question. And one of the people that actually worked with Gillis on his interest in the Bahama flora was Richard Howard of the Harvard University Herbaria, and he provided many leads to finding the answers to my question. So I drove up to Boston and Cambridge, actually, and I interviewed Dick Howard in 1993 at the Harvard University Herbaria to try to get some answers and documentation on what was going on. So the search to solve my question precipitated finding documents revealing a lack of ethics in grant proposal reviews and a story of, to our horror, dishonor, which is the subject of this seminar. Now, Hardy and I have published or have written a manuscript that was submitted and accepted for publication that gives the absolute background of the whole story, and I'm just going to give you a brief review of that. The publication should be out in this, we were promised that it would be out in the spring of 2024 in Huntia, the Journal of the Botanical History. So let's talk about, or let's see what we found. The National Science Foundation had conflicts of interest problems with grants to short-term employees. These short-term employees are known as rotators. And in 1979, the United States General Accounting Office, which is currently called the U.S. General Accounting Office, began a review of the National Science Foundation's policies and procedures for precluding conflicts of interests in its grant award process, specifically when NSF former short-term rotator employees were involved. The review was precipitated by a request from Congressman Carl D. Purcell, a Republican from Michigan, who had submitted this request in May of 1979. Congressman Purcell had made a request to the government office on behalf of a constituent. Now, I want you to know that this proposal or this review that they made did not reveal any names. So please keep that in mind. So he made a request on behalf of a constituent who unfortunately did not live to see the outcome of their review. A draft of the GAO 1981 report included a proposal for identifying conflicts of interest. And the National Science Foundation implemented that proposal, which concluded, quote, should provide greater visibility to potential conflict of interest situations associated with grants involving rotators, and to resolve conflicts in accordance with statutes and regulations. Additional specifics of this case that regarded Purcell's unnamed constituent. Purcell had asked for a review of National Science Foundation policies and procedures for awarding grants to former National Science Foundation employees. He specifically requested clarification whether these policies and procedures, including provisions for their waiver, adequately prevented conflicts of interest, and whether NSF complies with them. This is actually published in that report. The investigation, as summarized here, Purcell's interest in the case was brought to his attention by a researcher, unnamed in the report, from his home district, whose proposal NSF had declined to fund, although it later funded a similar project proposed by a former National Science Foundation employee. The government office investigation focused on the special problems of processing grants from short-term employees, the rotators, who work for National Science Foundation for 1 or 2 years, and to assess NSF grant award process as it relates to awards made to scientists who are being considered for or are serving in or have completed short-term appointments in the National Science Foundation. They found 39 problems in grant activity for 24 past and current short-term NSF appointees. Recall, this was investigation began in 79. The report was done in 81. 23 individuals in the sample, including the National Science Foundation appointee in the case involving Congressman Purcell's constituent. Contributing to the problem were decisions on this grant activity made by associates to the NSF appointees, and often the relationships were between supervisors and subordinates. Additional specifics. Questionable circumstances surrounded a waiver of post-employment restrictions and proposed review. Purcell's constituent had submitted a proposal that the National Science Foundation declined, but the decision on which to judge whether the constituent's proposal was treated fairly was limited because all files relating to it had been destroyed by the time of the government's review. That's a quote. Now, I'd like you to please keep this statement in mind, especially what I state in the highlighted dark brown lettering. I'll repeat it again. All files relating to it had been destroyed by the time of the government review. Around the time the constituent's proposal was rejected, another researcher began a 2-year rotational appointment at the National Science Foundation in the program office that had rejected it. The NSF appointee applied for a waiver to submit a proposal upon leaving NSF. After leaving NSF, the appointee submitted a proposal. It was the same subject as the constituents. What did they find? They found conflicts of interest. The former NSF employee submitted his proposal to the program that he had directed. The proposal review was completed in 3 months, according to their findings. It actually was 6 weeks. It usually took about 5 months to act on the proposals. So it was reported. But it was actually 8 months for the constituent's proposal to get his review back. The National Science Foundation program officer who made the award recommended for the former NSF program officer had earlier used the NSF appointee as a reference on his own application for his own employment at the National Science Foundation. And he had also worked for the former appointee. These were the findings from the USGAO. Now, with the help of Richard Howard, among others, we tracked down the grant proposals. In 1993, myself and my husband located all of Purcell's constituents' research files, including copies of both National Science Foundation grant proposals. The files were archived at the Michigan State University Herbarium and at the Fairchild Tropical Garden Herbarium and Library Archives. The documents at MSC, Michigan State University Herbarium, and at the Fairchild Tropical Garden Herbarium revealed that the NSF appointee was Donovan Carell, Program Director of Systematic Biology, and the co-author of the 1982 Flora of the Bahama Archipelago, and who they had funded twice, and which was in their preface to their book. Purcell's constituent was W.T. Gillis, the guy who did all those distribution maps, and was a former Fairchild Tropical Garden employee and the author of the original rejected grant proposal. Correll's National Science Foundation grant proposed writing an illustrated vascular flora of the Bahama Islands. He submitted it from the Fairchild Tropical Garden on October 1st, 1973, 2 months after he had left the National Science Foundation appointment, and it was approved 6 weeks later on 15 November, 1973. Much of the text was derived from the grant proposal previously submitted to the National Science Foundation by Gillis from the same institution. Here's the case as was summarized by the USGAO in 1981. The National Science Foundation awarded the former NSF appointee more than $90,000 over 5 years. Within the 5 years, he requested and was granted an increase that brought the total award to more than $100,000. During the 6 years, he was awarded about $40,000 in additional funds, and the grant period was extended to a total of more than 7.5 years. One of the major arguments made by reviewers of Gillis's 1970 National Science Foundation grants proposal, which we found at the Michigan State University Herbarium, was to prepare a manual and a flora of the Bahama vascular plants. And the argument was that the cost was too high. Yet, the USGAO report revealed that Correll received over 75% in funding for one investigator, himself, and for fewer years of support than Gillis had originally requested for 3 researchers, himself, Dr. Howard, and Dr. Proctor of the Institute of Research in Jamaica, who was also researching the flora of the Bahamas. Well, the question is this really a plagiarized grant proposal? Revising and submitting a Bahama Flora grant proposal might be justified by assuming the project was the purview of the institution where it had been initiated. That's all well and good, except that the argument doesn't really fly because it wasn't the institution that started this, but it was actually the researchers within that institution whose idea it was. Correll's October 1973 grant proposal misrepresented what actually happened. They said Gillis's involvement in initiating the project in 1968 at Fairchild Tropical Garden. They did not include the fact that Gillis's involvement initiating the project in 1968 at Fairchild Tropical Garden. They misrepresented it as an institutional proposal, which it was not. It was only signed by the institution director, but he had nothing to do with the grant proposal. Gillis and collaborators having priority and partial funding for the Bahama Flora project was ignored. They did not cite any of the previous or current publications that Gillis had done. It was not part of the grant proposal. And they did not acknowledge that there was priority, that someone else had started this project years before. What was the priority for writing a Bahama Flora? In 1970, Gillis began collecting and published his first report towards writing a new Bahama Flora. The publication came out in 1970, and we cited it in 1991. With Richard Howard and Dick Proctor, Gillis continued the project until he died, his untimely death in 1979. He died on June 20th, in 1979, approximately 2 months after the investigation began by the USGAO. Picture on the right, on the bottom, shows Howard and Gillis with the students doing research in the Bahamas in the early or the mid-1970s. The National Science Foundation had recognized that it has been less than successful in addressing the unique problems associated with the rotator program. That's a quote. The United States government organization report had sensitized NSF employees to conflicts of interest problems in the rotator program, they reported. And accordingly, the National Science Foundation will take steps to address new conflicts of interest policies. With respect to the case at hand, meaning the issue with the constituent, the National Science Foundation planned to issue a directive that all staff in grades GS 12 and above who are leaving the National Science Foundation be especially counseled by the ethics counselor. The ethics counselor is in the Office of the General Counsel at NSF, about post-employment conflicts of interest restrictions. Further, they report that a former employee is precluded during 1-year period after the National Science Foundation's service from submitting a new proposal to the National Science Foundation as principal investigator and from receiving compensation under any NSF award other than one on which he or she suspended work when coming to the foundation. That appears in their appendix. The final conclusion, I say, yet the National Science Foundation believed that none of the basic rules that they used to guard against conflicts of interest involving rotators was violated in any of the cases cited in the draft report. That's in Appendix 3. So NSF is still denying that they did anything wrong. The USGAO believed that their final recommendations to the director of the National Science Foundation, if they were implemented, would resolve conflicts of interest questions for the National Science Foundation. The enforcement of the National Science Foundation policies might have reassured Bill Gillis that a case such as his would not be repeated. As I said, unfortunately, he didn't see this decision because he died in 1979. Nevertheless, our findings revealed that basic rules from the NSF had been used to guard against conflicts of interest involving rotators were violated. So when we did our research, when we found the documentation, it was clear to us that these interests were definitely violated, although NSF denied it. So our conclusion, keeping within historical perspective, we may recall the words of the Roman historian Tacitus. The principal office of history I take to be this: to prevent virtuous actions from being forgotten, and that evil words and deeds should fear an infamous reputation with posterity. Now, this is an interesting conclusion only if one can get the information out that proves that there was a problem. Hardy and I have been trying to get this paper published for 20 years, and no one would publish it until last year. Acknowledgements. These are all the places that we visited, talked to zillions of people to get the documentation for our story. The end. Thank you. I would like to entertain questions if you have them.
Hold on. Do you have a question, Judy?
I have a question. It has less to do with ethics and more to do with the biodiversity of the Bahamas.
Oh.
Judy?
Can you hear me? Want me to come up?
You hear Judy?
Yeah, I can hear her.
Okay, good.
Biodiversity of the Bahamas, you said something about.
Concerned with hurricanes slamming the Caribbean, that there are some flora that may be at risk.
What's the question?
Question was, are you concerned about hurricanes hitting the Bahamas and wiping out species?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. We lost a lot of plants during Hurricane Dorian. And one of the things that's important for the herbarium is to document the plants that were there and any that might have been lost. So right now we're in the process of doing that, and Ethan Freed and the Bahamas National Trust is working on that project. I haven't been directly to the Bahamas in a while, but I have colleagues who are working on San Salvador. And fortunately, the hurricanes on San Salvador haven't been as devastating as ones in the more western islands. But sure, we are definitely concerned about that. And I've written a recent article on the Bahama endemics, as has Ethan Freed. And we've published the importance of the endemics on which islands they are. And the publication that we recently wrote was about the endemics that we found on San Salvador, which are fortunately still safe. But I just learned recently that the Duke University Herbarium is being closed. And that is such a shame, because how are we going to document loss of diversity if the herbaria are not being kept up? So yeah, it is definitely a concern. But the other thing that's important is to plant trees like or not definitely necessarily trees, but mangrove trees specifically along the coast, so that they can protect the inland coastline. And when the mangroves get destroyed or are cut down, that causes a big problem. So we've advocated for replanting Bahamian species of mangroves that have been taken out, and they are doing that in many places right now. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but those are my comments.
Yeah, she says it answered your question. I have a question as well. Are there any invasive species that are causing problems in the Bahamas?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we have a list of invasives, and there's really not a lot that we can do about it. I mean, it's just like in Hawaii, they've been going through places and pulling them out. And, we do that on San Salvador too. Fortunately, San Salvador is like way out there. And so we don't have as many invasives as some of the other islands. If I go back to this picture, do you see my screen or not?
I need to share again.
Oh, never mind. Okay. So anyway, San Salvador is way out there, and is one of the islands that actually, I don't know if you know that or familiar with San Salvador Island, but it was the first one that Columbus landed on when he came to the New World. If you go to his log, you can see all the trees and plants that were on San Salvador when Columbus first landed, and we now know how many of those have been destroyed. Because what happened in the 1700s is that people from the United States came to the Bahamas to establish plantations, and they took out a lot of the trees and shrubs, and when they did that, all the topsoil ended up in the ocean. So the plants that are left are ones that can survive in a xerophytic environment, and also can have an association, mostly lots of legumes, because they have an association with the fungus that can provide nutrients. So that's what I can tell you.
We have several questions. Tim?
Hey Lee, thanks for a great talk. I hope you can hear me okay, but I'm curious if you've seen ethical issues in funding from other organizations other than NSF, maybe like public funding through the USDA or private funding through the Gates Foundation or something like that.
I have not looked elsewhere. One of the things I can tell you is that NSF now has a requirement that all rotators take a class on conflicts of interest. They have to take one. The NSF offers a class monthly, and rotators have to take at least one every, I forget what the exact number is, every couple of months or at least once a year, to understand conflicts of interest. And if you find a conflict of interest, or if you think there is one, you can report it to the counselor. So they have ways to do that now. And all that stems from this paper, from this investigation back in 1979 that that Gillis brought to his congressman and said, look, you know, this grant was stolen from me, and I want you to investigate it.
Yes.
I was just curious if you think the current conflict of interest policy is sufficient, or do we still have ways to go, and what your suggestions would be to improve the policies around conflicts of interest with the NSF?
Yeah, I mean, I personally have not been involved with the National Science Foundation. As a matter of fact, I have to tell you that when Hardy and I first started this project, and we did get one paper published in Rhodora about this guy's Gillis's contributions to the Bahama flora. And we wanted to say something about what we found with the conflict of interest. And the editor of Rhodora said, you can't do that. You can't publish it. You have to cryptically write it so that it's not obvious. So we modified the paper and he published it. But the other thing he said was, if you publish this paper, you will never, ever get an NSF grant. That's what he told us. The editor of Rhodora told us that. Now that didn't happen, because I do have gotten NSF grants. But we were warned that if we publish anything about this, we would not be granted funding in the future. And it's been over 20 years. We've been trying to get this paper published, and we couldn't get it published until very recently, when the people at the Hunt Institute said, yeah, we'll publish it. So I don't know I can't answer your question. I do not know if there have been recent conflicts of interest in grant proposal reviews. But if there have been, then people now have a recourse to report them, where they didn't have that before. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. A question over here.
Can I just jump in here? This is Larry Smart.
Hi, Larry.
So I was a co-PI on an NSF project that was led by Matt Olson at Texas Tech. This was in the Dimensions of Biodiversity program. It included Matt as a PI, myself, Steve DeFazio at West Virginia.
Steve, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And another colleague at University of Wisconsin. And the original 4-year grant, I thought, was very successful. I thought we published a ton of papers. It was in the US-China program, so our Chinese collaborators also published a lot. And then when we went to renew the project and continue it, Matt decided to rotate at NSF. And then Steve decided to rotate at NSF. So neither one of them could be listed as PIs on
Correct.
the renewal. And even beyond that, when it went for review, it had to go to a different, I think even a different division for the decision, because Steve was rotating in that division, and they couldn't make a decision within that division because he was there. And in the end, it wasn't renewed. And I partially blame those guys for rotating at NSF, because they could not be listed as co-PIs on the renewal proposal, even though I thought it was a fantastic project. But, you know, that's life. These things happen. But
Well, now you have some background on why that happened.
and now you know Steve is still at NSF. So.
Oh, yeah. I know. He was in the biology department at West Virginia University, and now he's at NSF.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Oh, you're welcome.
Your question?
It's related to previous questions already, but just curious how you tout your case from 1981 and contemporary time and how we should be, especially as early researchers, be looking out for these conflicts of interest in the NSF and other granting agencies. And yeah, just like the stealing of ideas, etc.
I didn't quite hear the whole question. I'm sorry.
It's about early career researchers. How should you be concerned about conflicts of interest? Is that?
Yeah, how this case from 1981 can be situated in contemporary times.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. So I teach a graduate genetics seminar here at West Virginia University. I co-teach it. And we actually presented this story to my class as a practice seminar a couple of weeks ago. And they were very concerned. They said that these are graduate students. So they said they really wanted, they were very happy to hear the story and were very interested in knowing about how to preclude conflicts of interest in proposals and reviews. And not only that, but in reviewing papers as well. So I think that the thing to do is use it as a lesson in a graduate seminar, maybe, to teach graduate students, as we're doing here, about the possibilities to prevent conflicts of interest. Does that answer the question or not?
Yeah, she says, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. When you first wanted to present, I didn't realize, oh my goodness, historian can present something fascinating. At least for me, I don't know for all of you online. I felt you're not only a historian, almost like a detective. I almost felt it can be used as a script to make a movie. I won't be surprised.
Thank you. Well, if you think this is an interesting story, you should look forward to reading my book about Barbara McClintock, where I've uncovered a whole bunch of documentation that reverses a lot of mythology. So that should be out in June. I'm just giving you a little bit of a warning. A warning.
Related to that, I felt 20 years you have been so devoted to this publication, almost on a mission. So I'm wondering.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, when you originally asked that question, that was completely without any background. It's just a question. You already have some hint or some information, so you were.
No, I didn't have any hint at all. All I knew is that I was looking for publications to include in my book from that, which was published in 1991, and in order to document the publications that had been already done for the island of San Salvador, I wanted to make sure I found everything that I could include in my bibliography for my students, so that they could go to the primary papers. Because one of the things I loved about learning at Cornell is that Cornell always required, when I was taking classes, required us to read primary papers rather than reviews. And every class that I took, we'd get a handout with primary papers to read. And so I took that as a way of teaching. And whenever I write a paper or, wrote my books, I always tried to find the primary papers. And so I was looking for the primary papers, and they weren't listed in this book. And so I said to Hardy, how come they're not listed? Why were they ignored? And the answer is that, this guy, the Corrals, didn't want any part of Gillis. They didn't want him involved in their project at all. It was a cover-up, I think. So that's, like, I sort of, this project, it just fell into my lap. And Hardy was wonderful in collaborating with me. As a matter of fact, the first paper that I tried to publish on the contributions of Bill Gillis, when I sent it to the Rodora, the editor did not want to publish it at all, as I mentioned. And so I called Hardy on the phone, and I said, at the time, I think he was the president of the Botanical Society. And so he picked up the phone and he called the editor and he goes, what is the matter with you? Why don't you want to publish this? And he was afraid to publish it because of what we had found. And so I said to the editor, well, what if I put Hardy's name on the paper? And he goes, well, that might help. So I said to Hardy, well, if I'm going to put if your name is going to be on the paper, then you have to do something. You have to write part of this paper, or it's unethical for me to just stick your name on the paper. So he went back and looked through his files, and then he added some stuff to the paper, and then the paper came out in 1993, I think it was, Contributions of Bill Gillis to the Flora of the Bahamas, and it's by Kass and Eshba.
Any other questions? Those of us that have worked with Lee know for sure that Lee is one persistent person. And so just keep that in mind. Lee, I just recently read Daniel Stone's book, The Food Explorer, about David Fairchild.
Oh, David Fairchild, the anti-Semite, yes.
And
sorry, that just came out.
the Fairchild Botanic Gardens. I assume that you visited that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I'd really love to see it. I heard it's a beautiful garden there.
It's an incredible place. And as a matter of fact, there's a living Bahama collection there that the director at the time, when Bill Gillis was working there, had put together this living Bahama collection, which he was collecting horticultural varieties that were xerophytic, that, that could survive in a Florida environment. And so he wanted to plant these horticultural varieties in the in Florida, which he did. And if you go there, you can find them, you can see them. And that's the only connection that the director at the time had to the flora of the Bahamas. As a matter of fact, Bill Gillis was so upset with him because every time he would collect a specimen and put it in the herbarium, he wouldn't make a label for it to say where it was collected, when it was collected, all that stuff that a taxonomist does. When a taxonomist collects plants and makes a label for the herbarium, he never did that. He just was interested in what color the plants were. And so when Bill Gillis established, or the herbarium for the Fairchild Tropical Garden in 1968, when he was hired there, he started the herbarium and then decided that he wanted to do a flora of the Bahamas. And the director, whose name I'm not mentioning, of the project, said, whatever you want to do, it's up to you. You're the researcher. And he said, I want to do a flora of the Bahamas. And he said, okay, fine. And Dick Howard said, well, you should put a recommendation in, or proposal into the National Science Foundation. And so they submitted it in 1970, and the director's name was not on it except the cover letter, which said, yes, he's working at my institution and it's okay for him to submit this proposal. But years later, then he says, no, the proposal belonged to the institution. So
Are there any other questions for Lee? We're getting close to running out of time.
There's one chat.
So there's one in the chat.
okay, you want to read it to me, please? Because I'm not doing very well with this. What's the question?
Anything known about professional relationship between Gillis and Correll? Strong mutual dislike preceding the NSF proposal. What is so striking to me beyond plagiarism is the subsequent ignoring of Gillis's work in Correll's book. And this is from.
Okay, so I can answer that. All right, so Gillis was working at Fairchild Tropical Garden, and he was fired. He was fired because he didn't get along with the director. And the director fired him. And then he went to Harvard to continue the project of the Bahama flora at Harvard. And the director of the Fairchild Tropical Garden then contacted Correll, who was at the time program director at NSF. And while he was program director, he and his wife went to the Fairchild Tropical Garden and had a meeting, and it's all documented that they met and said, we're going to write a Bahama flora. And so then the director took the grant proposal and rewrote it along with Corral and his wife. And when Gillis found out that they were going to redo or submit the grant proposal and had gotten it, he said he wrote letters to Corral, zillions of a couple dozen letters to Corral, and he kept saying, "I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you. What do you need?" And every time he published a paper, he would send the paper to Corral. And I've got a stack of papers that were signed by Bill Gillis that was sent to Fairchild Tropical Garden to Corral saying, "Here are the papers I'm writing about the Bahama flora." None of them are cited in his book.
All right, well, on that
Well,
note,
that's the background I can tell you between Corral and Gillis.
let's give Lee a hand for a wonderful talk.
Courage and justice. Yeah, I think that's the take-home message for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your help with the technology.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.